All right, good afternoon. Once again, good to see everybody here. Today we're going to be picking up in our study in Genesis chapter 11. So if you want to turn there, Genesis chapter 11. And we're going to be dealing with really the last big major story. From chapters 1 through 11, you have this big swaths of time going by. You have generations being spoken of at a time, thousands of years being passed, big global events, things in connection to the entire human race. We're going to see one more story like that, but then when we get into chapter 12, we're going to see the writer of Genesis really hit the brakes. And from being a really panoramic view of things, it's going to really be down to somewhat of a microscopic view, where we're going to really start tracing Abram, who later becomes Abraham, and then his descendants down from there. And so this is our last real story concerning really the entire human race per se. And it has to do with the Tower of Babel. And again, this is contained in Genesis chapter 11. Now last week we covered, of course, chapter 10 and the genealogy. And we had kind of an allusion to the event that we're about to cover this afternoon when we were looking at the sons of Ham. In chapter 10, in verse 6, you have Ham having Cush, and then Cush has a man by the name of Nimrod, a son by the name of Nimrod in verse 8. It says, "Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, in Erech, in Akkad, in Calneh, in the land of Shinar." So this is the same area that we're going to be studying today in chapter 10, where we're going to see the place that they kind of congregate and get stuck at becomes named Babel. And it's in the land of Shinar, as chapter 11 verse 2 mentions. This is also during the time, if you're following Shem's descendants, this is also during the time of Peleg in verse 25 of chapter 10, where it says, "Two sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided." So it seems to be an indication of it happening during the time of Babel, which is when actually the earth was divided. Their languages were disrupted and they scattered over the earth, as we'll see in a moment. And so we've got in when we get to chapter 11, we're kind of backing up a little bit. We're only just a few generations in the genealogy. So Nimrod was like the grandson of Ham, and then Peleg, who was around at the time of chapter 11, he was the great-grandson of Shem. So we're just a few generations past the sons of Noah when we get into chapter 11. So the story kind of talks about mankind and how they kind of went amiss again. God had started over with Noah. If you remember that, he re-established his covenant with creation. They get a new start, a clean slate. Noah even messes up with the drinking of the wine and getting drunk and getting naked, and then also with Ham and the way that he responds to that situation. So things start getting off track fairly early, and we're going to see them continue to get off track as we get into chapter 11. So what I'd like to do is really just read the story. It's only 9 verses, and that way we get kind of a general view of what's going on, kind of bring to the surface again some things in the story so that we can go back and make comment. But it starts off in verse 1. "Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.' The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, 'Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. All right, so clearly the human race is getting off track. If you remember in chapter 9 and verse 1, the Lord said, where it says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And what we find here in chapter 11 is them kind of shrugging the responsibility of filling the earth, and they want to stay put where they are. And so they're going to build this tower. They're doing it to make a name for themselves. They're doing it so that they will all remain in one spot and not fill the earth. And God looks down on what they're doing, which is very interesting, because when you think about it, whenever mankind becomes very ambitious and we think we're achieving something great and we think we're doing wonderful, think about the past few generations where we've made all of these advances in medical science and biology. We've even sent someone to the moon. We have all of these fancy satellites and these different telescopes that can see other galaxies and things. And we think we've achieved a lot, but even now today, God still has to stoop down to see what we're doing. God is sovereign above everything that we do. No matter our accomplishments, no matter how great we think we've gotten it, or how well we think we're doing, the Lord still has to stoop down to see. And he stoops down and he sees what they're doing. They're building the city with a tower, trying to make a name for themselves, trying to figure out a way where they can stay congregated in that one area. And the Lord says, this is not good. If they continue on like this, they're basically going to get to the point where there's nothing impossible for them. And he confuses their language, and that causes them to spread. Just the story kind of in a nutshell. So now let's look at this story verse by verse and kind of see some things that we can learn from the story about the situation, the historical situation here, but also some things that we can make applicable to our own lives. It says in verse 1, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Now keep in mind, this is only a few generations after Noah. All right, so we're dealing with Noah's grandsons, at the most maybe his great-grandsons. So not a lot of generations for you to get a whole lot of different languages at this point. They're probably all speaking the same language that their grandfather or their great-grandfather had spoken. They're all speaking one language. They're all saying the same words. The human population is probably still relatively small, though, given the long expanse of lifespan that they have. There's still enough time for them to really accumulate a pretty decent population, but still small enough to where they can still communicate the same, use the same language. And then in verse 2, there's a significant statement there. It says, and it came about as they journeyed east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now, this land of Shinar is in the region of Mesopotamia, in between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. And so if you're looking at your biblical map, maybe you have one in the back of your Bible or something, you would have, of course, over there towards the west, you would have where Israel is. And then all the way east, real far east, you would have Mesopotamia, where Babylon is going to be, which is the same area. This is where Assyria is going to come from. All these major nations are going to come from, but they're far east. But what's interesting is that, remember on the ark, they landed on Mount Ararat. It specifically said what mountain they landed on. Well, Mount Ararat is way far north. It's way far north above this land of Shinar, the Mesopotamia region. And it is a little bit west. So when they are traveling from there to this land of Shinar, they would have been traveling east. But if you're looking at it from a map, they would have been traveling a lot more south than east. But it would have been kind of a southeastern trip that they would have made. And it's interesting that the writer of Genesis focuses on the fact that they're going east, not so much that they're going south, even though maybe typically that's what you would mainly focus on. And I think that there's some type of theological point that the writer is trying to make here. Because as you go through the book of Genesis, all the way up until we get to chapter 12, we're going to find, or we do find, that everyone's traveling east. When we think about the Eden, you know, they were there in Eden and they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God kicked them out of the garden. Where did he kick them out? He kicked them out east of the garden. And then you hear about, you read about Cain killing Abel. And as retribution for that, the Lord sends him, kicks him even further away from the garden. He goes east in the land of Nod. And now you have in the flood, after the flood, you know, they land in Mount Ararat, which is kind of east, even further east. And now they're traveling in further east. So what might be being relayed here is the fact that people are traveling east. In other words, they're getting further and further away from Eden. They're getting further and further away from God's original plan for mankind. What it could be symbolizing here. And what we're going to find when we get to Abram is that he's not going to go east, he's going to go west. And it's going to be a geographical pointer to us to show that God is turning things around for the human race. And it's through Abraham that God's going to try to get the human race back on track again. And ultimately he does through one of Abraham's descendants, Jesus Christ. But I think that there is some significance here that they are traveling east, and that's what the writer focuses on. And they find this plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And rightfully so, because the Mesopotamia area was just, it's in between these two major rivers. It was a very fertile land, plenty of grass, plenty of vegetation for your animals, plenty of food for your family, for the cities that might be established there. It's no surprise that major nations come from that region. Babylon and Assyria, you know, they would have had plenty of resources being in that particular region. And it's no doubt as to why they would have wanted to settle there in Shinar. I mean, why not? It's a very comfortable place. It was a place full of resources. They had everything that they would have needed to flourish. But the problem is that they weren't told to stay in one spot. No matter how fertile it was, no matter how green it was, no matter how many resources they could gather from it, they were supposed to fill the earth. But they settled here. And it says in verse 3, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They say, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heavens, or into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So now they want to build a city and a tower. And there's basically two reasons why they want to do that. They want to make a name for themselves, but they also want to avoid the divine command to spread out. They want to stay put where they are. And as we reflect on that and think about our own lives, you know, isn't it true that most of us, if not all of us, are trying to build something in our lives? We're trying to build maybe a family. Maybe we're trying to build a career. Maybe we're trying to build up our bank account. Maybe we're trying to build up our own reputation in the community or in society in general. Especially here in the United States, I think we kind of grow up into that mindset of, you know, I'm growing up, I'm going into adulthood, and now I got to start building things for myself, whatever they might be. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. There's nothing wrong with building up a family. Surely Delia and I have built up a pretty big family. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to build up a good career and get established in a career so that you can provide for yourself and for others. There's nothing wrong with building up a good educational background so that you can, you know, provide for your family better and be more knowledgeable about certain topics and things like that. Nothing wrong with that. Just like there was nothing wrong with building a city and a tower. Is there anything wrong with building a city or a tower? I don't know of any verse that says thou shalt not build a city or thou shalt not build a tower. The thing that they were doing, the actual thing that they were doing was not wrong. What was wrong was their motives behind why they were doing what they were doing. And so it is with us as well. You know, let us build our families, our bank account, our careers, our education and things like that. But let's do it all the while with the right motives. Notice as you read verses 3 and 4 what the focus is. Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And then in verse 4, they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city. And then it goes on and says, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Notice what they're focusing on in these two verses. Us, ourselves, we. This is what we want to do for ourselves. And that's really the indicator when we know that we're getting off track when we're trying to build up these various things in our lives is what are we doing it for? Are we doing it so we can better serve others? Are we doing it so that we can better serve God? Are we doing it dependent on God and in submission to God and in obedience to God? Or are we just trying to build a name for ourselves, trying to build a nice, safe nest for ourselves so that we can flourish and just live a comfortable life just for selfish purposes? That's a good indicator to know, am I doing this for the right reasons or for the wrong reasons? So they were really self-focused, self-interested, and they're trying to get to a state of self-sufficiency that we'll talk about here in a moment. But also they're trying to make a name for themselves. It says in verse 4, and let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we'll be scattered. They're trying to make a name for themselves, which seems to indicate that there's some pride going on here. They're wanting to achieve perhaps immortality through establishing their name. And it's been suggested, and I just mentioned this because it's interesting, not necessarily because we can find really any historical basis for it, but it's been suggested that what they might have done is when each person was making a brick for this tower, which by the way was probably a ziggurat, they found ziggurats that are very similar to what's described by the tower, which is it's a structure that has a big foundation and then it gets smaller and smaller as you go up. Not quite a pyramid, but kind of has steps. It goes up and it comes to a point. Anyways, but as they made each one of these stones, perhaps the person who made that brick engraved their name in that stone so that after the tower was completely built, all their names would be in the stone and people would remember them forever and they'd have a name that becomes basically immortal. Similar to what people do now, when they build a building in memory of so-and-so or someone donates money, they put their name on it. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's not being done out of pride. They seem to be doing it out of pride. And I'm not saying that they actually did that. That's just one of the suggestions that are out there. But we do know for sure from the scriptures that they are trying to make a name for themselves. So there's pride. So the question is, when we're busy about, doing human things, going out and trying to build a family, a career, all these things already mentioned, are we doing it for ourselves? Are we trying to build up our bank account so that we can serve others and help others and glorify God? Or are we trying to do it just so that we can impress people with how affluent our lifestyle is or how rich we are? Are we trying to get an education so that people will look up to us for how intelligent we are? A lot of times our self-ambition leads to pride, and that pride gets us off track and gets us off base. And we begin to approach life from the wrong direction. But the other thing that they did was they said, we'll make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So we already looked in chapter 9, verse 1, that that's exactly what they were supposed to do, fill the earth, spread over the face of the earth. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to hunker down there in Shinar where things were good and pleasant. But they were really using building this city and this tower as a means to kind of avert themselves or to bypass fulfilling the divine command for their lives. And that can be true of us as well. It might be that God is calling each of us to do something. Maybe there's something in your life or my life in which we have something on our heart. We have something that, I really need to be engaged in this particular activity. This is really where I should be focusing my life. This is what God has really called me to do. But we say, I'll do that after I get my education or after I get settled with my family or after I do this. And we allow these things that we are being ambitious about and working towards, not because we need to accomplish those to ultimately fulfill God's purpose for our life, but really to kind of divert ourselves from God's purpose and to really make an excuse not to fulfill what God is calling us to do and what God wants us to do in our lives. So all these things can be okay. Of course it's okay to build a family, a career, get an education. Those are great things. But if it's causing us to get off track spiritually, if it's causing us to be self-interested, self-indulgent, if it causes us to become prideful, if it causes us to get off track from God's true purpose for our life, that's when it becomes a problem. This is when it's becoming a problem for the people here at Babel. So then, verse 5, it says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. So he has to come down. They're trying to build a tower up to heaven, to reach the heavens. And God's, in this verse indicates they're not getting anywhere close. And that God still has to come down just to see what's going on. But they're still attempting to do it. In verse 6, the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they begin to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them." All right, so they're one people, they're in one area, they're speaking one language. And God says if this continues on, if they continue hanging out in this one area, eventually they're going to get to the point where there's nothing impossible for them. And that goes kind of contrary to what we believe, isn't it? Isn't it true that we as a human race, we want nothing to be impossible for us? That's what we're working towards ever since the Enlightenment in the 1700s, and especially in the 20th century and going into this century. That's what we've been working towards. Nothing will be impossible for us. We want to fix all of our problems. We want to have all the solutions. If there's some type of sickness or illness, we want a treatment for it. If there's any obstacle that we have, that we're even trying to overcome death. There's different people who are studying how to overcome death and trying to figure out, the secret to remaining youthful forever. We're dealing now with DNA and messing around with the DNA code in people's bodies to make, eventually they can make superhumans by doing that, they think. Anyways, we in the human race today, we have a very similar situation that was here. We're getting to the point, or at least we're trying to get to the point where nothing's impossible for us, that we can fix all of our problems, and we can overcome every obstacle. We don't need God in the picture anymore. We don't need God helping the human race. God can be in heaven doing his thing. Us humans, we got it all figured out down here. And from a human standpoint, that might seem appealing. Even if we're not talking about society, even if we're talking about our personal lives, wouldn't it be nice if we could figure out all of our problems? If every problem we ran across, there was an app for it on our cell phones, or there was some type of treatment we could get, or some type of training we could take, and overcome every obstacle in our lives. It sounds very appealing. And it almost seems like something we should be striving for, we think. But God says that's a bad situation for man to be in. It's a bad situation for mankind to get to the point where nothing's impossible for them. And God would say, because things have become, or nothing has become impossible for them, what does that do? It causes us to become less and less dependent on God. At least we think we're less and less dependent on God. To the degree that we think nothing's impossible for us is the degree to which we don't need God anymore. Because it's in those times when we realize that this situation is impossible. I can't overcome this hurdle. I cannot get through this trial or this trouble that I'm dealing with. Those are the times when we fall down on our knees before the Lord and seek his guidance, his power, and his strength. It's when we think nothing's impossible for us that we begin to drift from the Lord. And that follows through with what we'll read as we go through the Old Testament. Israel always did great. They always drew close to the Lord when they were in trouble. When the enemies were coming, when God would discipline them, bring in the Philistines or the Midianites or whoever else, and he would bring them in and they'd be in distress and they'd cry out to the Lord, and the Lord would deliver them in a mighty and great way, like with Gideon, and they would just love the Lord then. They were dedicated to the Lord, because God had just delivered them, and that would carry on for a few decades, and then what would happen? They would get comfortable again, they'd begin living in affluence, and their riches would get the best of them, and they begin to drift into idol worshiping, drifting away from the Lord. Then the Lord would send trials and difficulties on them, and they'd endure hardships and trials, and then they'd cry out to the Lord, and they'd want to draw close to the Lord. They'd get rid of their idols, and they would repent, and God would come and deliver them. And it's just this continual cycle over and over again, all the way through the history of Israel. And we don't want to be too harsh on Israel, because that's our experience as well. That's why I said before, and I'll say it again, the most dangerous place for us to be in spiritually is when we're comfortable, when things are going well for us. When there's plenty of money in the bank, we got plenty of clothes in the closet, we've got a nice roof over our head. Spiritually, that's really the most dangerous place. Not when we are trying to really struggle through life. We could just think about our own lives. I'm not saying that everybody's had this experience, but You know, you think about when you were in your 20s, maybe you're in college or you're just getting married and you're embarking on life for the first time, and you're living in an old rickety house and you could barely pay the bills and you're struggling to make ends meet. Life was difficult. Every day you woke up with challenges. You're trying to pay the bills that month. Sometimes you'd be able to pay them, sometimes you wouldn't. Those are the times that you really drew close to the Lord. That's when you were really seeking the Lord's help, His guidance, His strength to get through those difficulties. But as time goes on and we get established in our careers, we kind of start getting a nice paycheck. Maybe we pay off our house, and so we have a little bit of space there financially. We begin to get comfortable. Are we crying out to the Lord anymore? Are we down on our knees pleading to God that He would help us? No, life becomes kind of mechanical. It becomes like clockwork. Sun goes up, the sun goes down. We just kind of float through life in those comfortable times. And then we get old, and then we start seeking the Lord again. But there's like an in-between time where we have it pretty good. And so that's just kind of, we can all fall under that temptation to drift away from the Lord in the good times. And so, no, it's not good for mankind to get to the point where nothing's impossible for him, because then he's going to shut the door on God. And that's, of course, never a good thing. So God continues on in verse 7, "Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. What this shows us is that God's will is going to be done. And it's either going to be done in a pleasant way or in an unpleasant way. If God wants the human race to spread and fill the earth, the human race is going to fill the earth. God's going to make it happen. The question is, will the human race go along with God's plan? And will they flow with the will of God or try to swim upstream against the will of God? And the same thing is true with our lives. God's going to accomplish His will and His purpose here on the earth. The question is, are we going to flow in the stream of God's will and safely be guided by His purpose and plan for our lives? Or are we going to constantly be fighting God? His plan and His purpose is going to be accomplished, but one way is going to be a little bit more pleasant than the other. He was going to bring the Messiah one way or the other, but because the people that He sent the Messiah to rejected Him and all that, it didn't go well for that generation. And the same thing is true with us. If we want a better go at life, let's get into the will of God. Quit fighting the will of God, but actually step into the will of God, because His plans and purposes are going to be accomplished. And we want to go through it more unscathed than if we violate His will and start trying to assert our own will. Typically when that happens, it gets ugly, as it does here. Had they submitted to God, had they filled the earth, yes, maybe eventually they would have developed different languages. You know, we have languages now. Latin developed into several different languages. German developed into different languages. Eventually, they probably would have began to speak in different languages, but it would have been a slow and natural process that would have just came over time. This seems to be a very abrupt and disruptive way in which God confused their language, and it caused them to scatter, which would have caused relationships to be severed, maybe even families to be split up, as they, in a more drastic way, had to be divided over the face of the earth. And so it wasn't as pleasant as it would have been had they just submitted to God's will and just scattered over the earth like they were supposed to. In verse 9, therefore, its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. You ever talk about someone who's just babbling and they're just going on and on, you don't really know what they're saying? Probably has this idea tied to it, the Tower of Babel. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So here the Lord had confused the language of the whole earth, and they were scattered. Now, we talked about this before, and I think it's pretty neat that we're studying this story at the same time as we're going through Acts chapter 2, because Genesis chapter 11 is when language is confused and people are scattered. Acts chapter 2 is when the Spirit gives them tongues to speak in which everyone can understand, and there's an ingathering of people, God's people, into the kingdom. And so here we have really a curse being placed on mankind, In Acts chapter 2, we see a blessing being placed on mankind, and they all come together. Now, one more piece of trivia, or whatever you want to call it. In verse 9, it says the place was called Babel. Now, this place, Babel, is what will later be called Babylon. Okay? And that may sound familiar to you. Here we have at the beginning, before Abraham even begins his journey, before he's ever called by God, you have Babel being created. How's it gonna come full circle? Eventually, after we get through a very long story of Israel's history, where are they gonna end up? Right here in Babel, right here in Babylon, in captivity. And that's kind of where the story kind of leaves off, at least the narrative in the text kind of leaves off with them going to Babylon in captivity, then yes, them coming back to Jerusalem, but all the difficulties that come, and they still kind of remain in an exilic type of existence until the coming Messiah. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting how things are going to go full circle. Eventually we'll find God's people back in Babel again. So that ends our study this evening. Next week, we're going to be looking at the descendants of Shem, but we're not going to probably go into a whole lot of detail on that genealogy like we did in chapter 10. A lot of it was covered in or a small snippet of it, I guess, was covered in chapter 10. But we really want to get to Abram and his story. And of course, that's when the panoramic view is going to go to the microscopic view. And we're going to see God begin to turn things around for the human race. So